Thank you. Since we're among friends, let me tell you what happened when I was to be awarded the most influential person in sustainability issues. There's a thing called the bedroom clause, which means that after you're being told that you're going to be given this prize, and before everyone else is being told, you're not allowed to tell anyone, but you are still allowed to tell your really closest family. So then proudly I said to my wife, you know what? I'm going to be elected Sweden's most influential in sustainability issues. And then my wife, she said, but are you really? And then I said to my 16-year-old teenage daughter, you know what? Next week I'm going to be announced to be Sweden's most influential person in sustainability issues. And I said, but you can't tell anyone. It's super secret. And she said, Dad, do you think anyone cares? So my recommendation, if you feel that you are, if you're afraid of losing foothold or reality grasp, just make sure you have friends and family that bring you back to normal life. I want to do something completely different as opposed to the great Norwegian experience we just had. We're not going to go slow, we're going to go fast. We're going to go 15 time zones around the world in 30 minutes. So we're not going to focus on an individual country, not Norway, not Sweden, but the whole world. We're not going to focus on great things I've done, thank you for mentioning some of them, but on great things that we can hopefully achieve together. We're not going to focus on something that might be relevant to some of us, such as slow television or our own historic background that we heard earlier today, but something that is, whether we like it or not, super relevant to all of us, and that is the theme of climate change and how to combat that. And over the years, when I've been speaking about this in, I think, 5 continents and I'd say something like 50 countries and tens of thousands of people, I've noticed that some people really do care, and mostly those are the people that do show up. But others don't care all that much. They have other things that they care more about that are more pressing or more urgent, or that their family relatives or that their CEOs tell them to focus on. So that's why I want to go through, that's why I want us to take a trip around the world to see how we can focus on the all-important issue of climate change without probably even mentioning it. So we're going to follow the sun. You know, the sun rises in the east, it sets in the west. We're going to start out with sunrise, and then time zone by time zone, we're going to find, hopefully, 15 different ways of working with this issue. And hopefully some of them are going to resonate with you, some of them are going to be relevant for you, some of them are going to be stuff that we can use together. And hopefully some of you are going to raise your hand and say, well, what about time zone number 16 or number 17? Or I disagree with time zone number 9, but I'm going to use time zone number 3 and number 5 when I get back to work or back to my studies, or when I meet my professors or my dad or whoever we want to focus on in this important endeavor of ours. So without further ado, let's embark on our 15 time zones. And we're going to start in the land of the rising sun. Which country is this? Japan, right. And since we're going to talk about climate change, this is a more tricky question. But since we're going to talk about climate change, where in Japan might we be? So this is Kyoto. Anyone here who has been there? This is the Temple of Kyoto. And Kyoto is also, in the early 90s, the place where we had the first ever legally binding global climate agreement. People like myself, I was young at the time, were applauding this and saying, wow, this is great. It's legally binding. It tells country after country how much they have to reduce their emissions and by what year. It actually even tells what's going to happen if you fail. Then you're going to have to double your effort in the second period. Of course, it was not for all of the countries, it was for the developed countries, countries such as Hungary and Sweden, but not countries such as Zambia or Zimbabwe, which also makes sense because we created most of the problem. So we should take care of most of the responsibility to reduce emissions. Now, I can see here that most of you might not have teenage daughters, like I mentioned earlier. But I think a lot of us can either relate to us having those daughters or sons, or being those daughters and sons. And can remember what happens when you try and force something on somebody who might not want to do what they've been forced to do. There will almost always be a way out. And that's also what happened with the United Nations Climate Protocol. It was legally binding, and when it was legally binding, what happens when a country realized, well, I'm not going to meet those targets? Australia realized we're not going to meet our targets, so they said, well, we are leaving the Kyoto Protocol. We're not part of it anymore. Bye-bye. The second country to leave was the host country itself, Japan. It said, well, we're not going to meet the targets, so we're glad that you came here and that you signed up to the agreement, but we're not part of the agreement anymore. And then it was time for the second commitment period. The first commitment period ended in 2012. We had the, these annual United Nations meetings. You've heard about them. The Paris meeting we had the other year. And every year there's one such meeting. And we were supposed to agree on the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, who thinks that that sounds really inspiring, a commitment period? There's not even, for those of you who are not turned the other way around, let me record for you that there's not one single hand in the air. That's also what happened. There was no enthusiasm. And the second commitment period never even started. There was only 3 countries in the EU that signed up for the second commitment period. Incidentally, one of them was Hungary, and none of them was Sweden. So it never entered into force, and that's what happens, and that's my main takeaway from the first of 15 time zones. That if we try and force others to do something against their will, it's not going to end up great. We managed to find a way out, and that's what happened with the first legally binding climate agreement. So if you're with me on this one, we need to find other ways of making this attractive. Not force it down the throat, but make people want to go there. That brings us to the second time zone. This is, of course, the Middle Kingdom, which is which country? China. And this is not that there's too much light in here or that the picture is poorly taken. This is how it looks if it's a beautiful morning in the suburbs of Beijing. You know, around the world, there's a very interesting experience or experiment that's being done. You take a box of crayons, all colors that you might find. You go to a kindergarten, a preschool. You tell the 4-year-olds, here's a paper, here's all the crayons, just paint the sky. And then you watch and you wait, and you see what crayons are they going to go for. All around the world, the kids go for one of the blue crayons, except in China, where all kids go for one of the gray crayons, because that's the way they perceive the sky. And in the last few years, we've seen one superpower saying, well, we're not very convinced about climate change, we're stepping back. And then we saw another superpower, China, immediately wanting to fill the void and say, well, we are going to step up our climate ambitions. And in fact, China said, we're going to close 1,000 coal power plants by 2020. And we're going to peak our emissions by 2030, and then they're going to go down. Now, who in here really fully trusts the Chinese? Again, not a single hand in the air. And me neither. I did not trust those promises from the Chinese. And so many others did not either, so they were actually checked up upon. Do you read The Economist? This would be the place where you read The Economist. Some of you do. The Economist said, okay, so 1,000 coal power plants that are going to be closed. Let's just look on Google Earth. You can look them up. Google Earth. Are they open or are they closed? Are they decommissioned or are they still open? And even though it's not 2020 by far yet, 1,254 coal power plants have already been shut. And then the Stockholm Environment Institute that we work closely with and other environmental institutes started looking at those emission figures. The CO2 emissions, are they really going to peak by 2030 and then go down? No. It turns out they have already peaked, according to some institutes. Others say that in a few years they're going to peak much earlier than needed according to the international promises and pledges. Now the cynics tell me, Mattias, that's got nothing to do with climate. They're not doing this to reduce their climate emissions. They're doing this because of air quality. When they switch to electric vehicles and buses like the one we see a few of here in Budapest, or when there's not a single moped or motorcycle to be found in Beijing that has a combustion engine anymore, they're all electric, all of them electric. That's not for climate, it's good for the climate, but the reason is the air quality. Or if you want to be even more cynical, it's not air quality, it's that the Chinese authorities want the Chinese people to show up for work. There's simply too many sick days with such a poor air quality. There's also way too many days when the kids are told, don't come to school today, the air is so unhealthy, you should just stay indoors, don't go to school. And that means reduced competitiveness in the future. There's also people like us, people like you, who are thinking, well, I'm Chinese, I live in China, but where do I want to live in the future? And they're all saying, well, my career is going to be somewhere else, largely part to that poor air quality. Or international people like you who are thinking, well, where do I want to do my future career? Certainly not in China, because the air quality is so poor, I lose 6 to 8 years of my life. So the Chinese are not doing this for climate. They're doing it for local environment, or they're doing it for competitiveness. And you know what? I don't care. In fact, I'm even gladder and more happy when it's done for other reasons. This is very much in line with what we heard from our Danish friend this morning, who said that most Copenhageners don't bike for the climate. They bike because it's convenient, it's fast, it saves them money, and it's good for the health. So the same reason again, the Chinese are not forced to do this. They do it voluntarily, and they do it faster because they see so many co-benefits. We move to the third time zone. Do you recognize this guy? Who is this guy? The Indian president. The Indian president Modi, who's looking at one of his solar cells. And I was there because I've been told that there was a solar power revolution in India. Who here has been to India? Did you see the solar cell revolution? You did not. I did not either. So after I was there a month, I didn't see it. So after a while I asked, well, where is it? Are you tricking us? And the Indians, they said no. So you are from Western Europe, they said. Well, in Western Europe, you have more money than you need, so you put solar panels on your roofs, house by house, because you want to impress your neighbor. You want your neighbor to see those. But we need to be more energy efficient, more cost efficient here in India, so we put them in large, like this, like a large field of solar cells, where it costs less. And also the Indians told us that, you remember a few years ago, the Indians tried to become successful in football. Soccer, do you remember that? And they failed. So now they have all these soccer stadiums. So you can actually go to some of them, and inside those stadiums there's solar panels. And the good thing is the admittance is free. You can sit there and watch. It's going to be very similar to slow television, incidentally. And then I said, well, that's great. That's so good for climate, what you're doing. And this guy and his friends say, no. This is not about climate. This is about 300 million Indian middle-class people who want to be able to turn on a light bulb the way their parents could not, or want to be able to drive a car the way their parents could not. You know, in India, the Tata and the Hindustan and those other car makers are booming fast now. And India, being the second largest country in the world, they did the math. So if 300 million people are all going to drive cars, what's going to happen with air quality, and even is there going to be enough oil for those 300 million people? No, there's not. So this guy, and this is the largest democracy in the world, this guy, he said, well, in order for me to be re-elected, those middle-class Indians need to have their dream fulfilled. If that means them driving a car, we need to find a renewable source that doesn't end, that there's more of. So it can't be oil in the ground, it has to be sun from the sky. That's not going to end anytime soon. And so I was thinking, are the Indians really serious about this? And then I heard a government presentation the other week where the government minister, the Minister of the Union, because India is a federal state, the Minister of the Union, he said, to all you automakers, car manufacturers of India, if you continue making cars for fossil fuels, we are going to bulldoze your factories. Now this is true to the word. You can Google bulldoze plus India plus electric cars, and you will find this quote. It's not Greenpeace. It's the government saying that we are going to bulldoze those factories because otherwise he will not be re-elected. So again, it's beneficial for the climate, but climate is not the reason. So we thank him for that experiment and experience, and we move on one time zone to the west. This is a picture that's been taken secretly. It's my sound coming on and off. This picture was taken, you know, like this. I pretend I'm talking to the phone, but I'm really taking a picture of you. And you can see This is an OPEC meeting where President Putin and the oligarchs of the Middle East are discussing the oil price. Do you know how much a barrel of oil is these days? Roughly. $60 is very close to the actual figure, yes. $60. A few months ago, how much was it? It was down to 29. 30, exactly, 30. 60, 30 a few months ago. Before that, it was 60. Before that, it was 120, and it was, in fact, even up to 147. Before that, it was 60, 30, 15. Now, is this driven by how much oil there is in the ground? Of course not. That doesn't vary like that. It's driven by how well these guys agree. And let me assure you, it's only guys. The male domination is even stronger than on this stage. And so we have a prize that we call the big annual renewability prize of the year. It was given to IKEA, which is, I know is a household name here in Hungary. And it was given to IKEA because they are now 100% independent on energy. They produce all the energy they need from renewable sources that they own themselves. So I said to them, that's wonderful. You're doing such great work for the climate. And said, Mattias, it's not for the climate. It's for security of supply. We want to be in control of how much we get, where we get it from, and how much we pay. If it's costing $29 the other day and 60 now and maybe 147 in a few months, that's not the way we want to run things at IKEA. We want to be independent of these guys and their whims and how well they agree. Another reason why I would want to be independent of these guys is, I don't know about your sentiment, but to me, what Putin has done in Ukraine is not something I want to support. And yet, whenever I go and fill my car in Sweden, and I know the situation is the same in Hungary, if I fill it with petrol or diesel, or indeed natural gas, or if I use natural gas in my housing, half of it in Sweden is Russian, and it's the same figure or more in Hungary. So if you want to support Putin, there's no better way to do that than to go and fill your car. On the other way, if you don't feel like supporting Putin, well, find some other way. Go for those renewable fuels, and again, you will find the CO2 gain, the climate gain, in the vicinity of 80 to 90%. And that's only Putin. Then we got the other guys. Half of the oil is from Russia, and more is from the Saudi Arabia and its neighboring countries. Now, in Saudi Arabia, if you're women, not only will you not be presenting at this stage, but you will also not be allowed to drive a car. If you are found in Saudi Arabia to be driving a car, if you're lucky, you will only be whipped. If you're unlucky, you will be stoned. Also, if as a woman, you're found in a city where you don't have a written permit from your husband, signed and stamped by the police, you will be, if you're very lucky, whipped. Most likely you will be stoned. This is a country I'm not interested in supporting. And yet, whenever we use fossil fuels, we support these guys. So, if you're not interested in climate change, you think that's a topic for somebody else, think again where you put your money. If you want to support these guys, let's talk after the break, because we have a serious disagreement. And if you don't, please join me in the continuous journey to leave these guys behind. We move one time zone to the west and find ourselves in the world's first government meeting underwater. This is the Maldives. It was probably not strictly necessary to have the meeting underwater as yet, but this is one of the islands that has few years left, one of the kingdoms that has few years left before it is really underwater. That's not only faraway states, faraway small islands, it's also a country like Bangladesh with 100 million people, living in areas that cannot be sustained in many more years. It's also part, for instance, of Sweden, low-lying areas. When you will also find that even though Hungary is not going to be flooded by any ocean anytime soon, you will find that there's two issues of climate change. There's mitigation, reducing emissions, but we also need adaptation, how to adapt to a changed climate. Have you been to Stockholm? Some of you. Stockholm, there's the ocean. And then there's the sea, the lake, where we take all our drinking water, fresh water. And in between, there's Slussen, which is a wall to make sure that the salt water doesn't come into the drinking water. Because if it does, we're all doomed. And the way, now that the seawater is rising, the way to stop more seawater from coming into the sweet water is to put more cement. And when you put more cement, cement is just about the worst thing you can do for the climate. So when you put in more cement, emissions rise, then you need to put up more cement, and then emissions rise again. So you need to make sure that when you adapt for a changing climate, you don't do that in a way as to make climate even worse. So we bring that as a lesson. We hope that this is not going to be the new normal. We move one time zone to the west. This is a picture that I took myself when I was living in Kenya, as you mentioned. And we often see Africa as one country, is more than 50 countries. This is a picture from eastern Kenya. She's a farmer, and she farms jatropha, which is a biofuel. She uses the jatropha oil nut to bring oil for the generator, for the lamps, and also actually for the tractor that the village owns together. And I tell her, that's great what you're doing here. You're really reducing emissions when you're using a locally produced biofuel instead of fossil fuels. And she gets upset with me. She knows everything about climate change. She knows that previously she would put her maize or her corn in the ground the 1st of May. Because on the 15th of May, the long rains would always start. You would know it, that exactly on the 15th, the rain would be there. But nowadays, sometimes the rain comes on the 2nd of May, and then the maize is just flooded away. Or sometimes the rain only comes in the middle of June, and then the maize and corn has long since dried out and is dead and gone. So she knows all about climate change and how that's affecting her life, but she says, well, it's not really my deal to do anything about it, because you did it to us, and you need to solve it for us. But she also, do you remember there was a discussion about food versus fuel? If she produces biofuels, should she not really produce food? Why should she produce fuels, and especially fuels that we can use? Well, she says, I actually get more fuel, more food when I produce the biofuels, because this jatropha that I use is just slightly poisonous. You get a mild headache if you eat it, and that's enough to keep all the animals, the monkeys and the donkeys and the antelopes and other things, out of her shamba, out of her compound where she grows that maize that I talked about earlier. So she will find that it's easily combined, food and fuel. So we bring that experience with us. We move one time zone to the west and also closer to home. This is where I was just before coming here. I was there discussing what I think we need to discuss more. I think that often when we discuss the issues that we like the most, we also discuss it with the people that we like the most. And we tend to agree very much, and we don't move forward very much. I think that we need to focus more on those that are perhaps in the last wagon, those that are dragging the heels, those that are the most reluctant. And within the EU, sometimes been Hungary perhaps, but it's very often been Poland. Poland is the one that's been blocking many climate and energy resolutions within the EU, where every country has the veto. In the United Nations situation, every country also has the veto. So if one country doesn't want, it's not going to happen. And fairly often that country has been Poland. And I go there, and I speak to the steel worker. And I ask him, do you feel excited about combating climate change, about the new renewable energy sources? And he says, no, it's threatening my job. So I'm thinking we need to convince this guy and guys like him, because otherwise we're not going to get moving fast enough and far enough. And I think there's two solutions to that. One is the circular economy, where we're still going to use steel. He's still going to have a job. We're just not going to use the steel that we bring up from the ground with incredibly negative consequences for the climate. We're going to use the steel that's already around, being much better at circulating matters in the economy. And the second is that there's much more jobs in the renewable sector than in the non-renewable sector. You find more jobs in the agrarian fields, you find more jobs with the wind power plants and more jobs with the solar cells than you find in the non-renewable. And we're going to need to focus on those, because otherwise we're not going to have these guys on board. Now, in the 8th time zone, we're at my home. Sweden, a tiny, almost useless country in a global context. If we look at CO2 emissions or carbon impact, 0.15% is Sweden's. And then we just had a government coalition. We have 8 parties in Swedish politics. One is xenophobic and not interested in any other issues than keeping strangers out. We leave them aside. And then all the other 7 parties, they came together in a commission and they discussed, so what kind of climate legislation are we going to have in Sweden? And they started with this figure, well, we're only 0.15% of global emissions. Why do we even matter? And then they realized, well, the only way we can make a difference is by being so great, so much front runners, that the others will take note and be inspired. Because if theoretically, Sweden secretly now would reduce our emissions to 0, we'd turn off every engine, turn off every factory, we'd breathe in without breathing out again, nobody would notice around the world. Those global indicators of CO2 around the world would not notice those 0.15% suddenly disappearing. The only way we can make a difference is for people to say, well, I want to learn from Sweden. And that's why those 7 parties, they never agree on anything. That's party politics. There's the left-wing party, there's the right-wing party, and everything in between. But then finally, when it was really important, when it was about the future of humanity, when it was about combating the challenge of our lifetime, they managed to agree. They agreed to that by 2030, so in just 12 years, CO2 emissions from the transport sector, that we heard a lot from the Danes about, is going to be reduced by 70%, and 2045, we're going to have net 0 emissions. That's an 85% reduction. The remaining 15% are more sequestration in forests that can take up more CO2, suck more CO2 from the air, and also to do more in other countries where Swedes do it, and they say, we're going to take the bill for that, even though it's in a different country. And that is the toughest climate legislation in the world. It's easy to see because every country has pledged to the United Nations what they're going to do. And then we ask the industry, is that relevant for you? We're in a small country, very competitive. People might just go somewhere else and buy products if Swedish products are hampered and hindered by this. We have Scania, which makes trucks and buses. And Scania said, well, Sweden is only our 17th biggest market. 3% of our buses and cars and trucks are sold in Sweden. But it needs to be our most important market. The market where people see things first. And we added, and then there's so the world's first continuously inductively charged electric bus runs in Sweden, right outside of Scania's headquarters. You don't need to understand what that means. You just need to understand it was the world's first and it was only one. But then there was a delegation from California, the world's 5th biggest economy, that came there. And you know they're not well educated, they're not polite, the Californians. So they didn't say please. They just saw that bus and they say, we want 250 of those. And that's the way a small country can move forward. We can be, if we were to be number 74, 98 in terms of reducing emissions, those orders would never happen. It's only by being the front runner or the global help desk that we get these orders. So we get, and we know that we've seen the same with Denmark for wind. We've seen the same with Norway for electrification of vehicles. We're hoping that somehow you can transform your society to see Hungary as a front mover again also. We move one time zone to the west, continue to follow the sun. It's not easy to find more time zones within Europe, especially now that Great Britain is out. But we do manage to find one. It's in Portugal. These boys and girls are out there having fun kiting in the wind. And in Denmark, almost 50% of all electricity comes from wind. That means that fairly often they have more than 100%. And that's fairly easy in Denmark because they got so many neighboring countries where they can sell their surplus to. Sell it to the Germans, to the Swedes, to the Poles, to the Netherlands, even to Norway. Portugal has only one neighboring country, Spain. So when Portugal has almost the same percentage of wind power as the Danes, Portugal has 25%, they can only sell it to the Spains. And then to the Spaniards. And then I tell the Portuguese, it's a great thing what you're doing, 25% and electricity from wind, it's so great for the climate. And they say, well, you know what? It's really about us finally being the big brother to Spain. After 500 years of being the small brother, being trampled upon, they had the largest colonies, the biggest economy, the most popular language in every school. But finally, they have to buy something from us, and we don't buy it from them. And this might sound, very light and not serious. But then you look at big decisions, government by government, and small decisions, household by household, and you realize how important it is for us to impress on our neighbor or to have something that they might not have. So we have that at lesson number 9. We move on to time zone number 10. We were supposed to forget this. Both Sweden and Hungary and so many other European countries don't want to discuss this refugee crisis anymore. If we do want to discuss it, it's just in terms of keep them out. But we need to realize that those refugee streams are still there. When we ask the UNHCR, the UN agency for refugees, and say, well, isn't this refugee crisis soon over? They say, no, this is the new normal. And then we asked, how can it be the new normal? Syria has got to be empty by now, right? And they said, oh, it's not going to be Syria anymore. It's going to be climate-driven. The biggest source of refugees in the future is going to be climate-driven. Some of them are just going to move a few hundred meters further away from the river, but most of them are going to have to move much further. And this move brings me to those people. I know they exist in Hungary, just as they exist in Sweden. Those people who don't really care about climate or sustainability. They're just afraid of other people who have other names or other skin tones or other ways of cooking their food, I don't know what. If they're afraid of that, they should be very tough on combating climate change. And for us who are not afraid of people with different names and different skin colors, we want to invite them. We want them to come voluntarily, not to flee for their lives, because we know that's a much better way to start out a friendly dialogue together. So even though we were supposed to not see it, it might be a friendly and good reminder on these future issues. We come to time zone number 11. You might have noticed that I'd skipped Paris. The Paris Agreement is what people always talk about when it comes to climate. But you know, Paris was like the New Year's Eve party. We all dress up in our nicest dress, and then we all promise each other things. I'm going to quit doing this. I'm going to start doing that. I'm going to change my behavior. And then we know what happens with those New Year pledges. 9 out of 10, they don't ever happen. So the important part is not the New Year's party, it's afterwards. Those friends that come and say, well, we actually promised the same thing. Should we help each other? Should we both go there on Tuesday? And how do you count? How do we measure? How do we make sure we reach those targets? And that was the meeting after Paris. That was the meeting in Marrakesh. Who here has been to Marrakesh? Did you buy anything?
Yeah.
What did you buy?
Oranges.
What's that?
Oranges.
Oranges. But did you buy anything that you brought home?
Yeah.
You don't remember. But you were here, right? At the Geneva, you were there. I can still smell the smells there, and I can still remember this guy saying, this is a kilo. And I thought, it feels like 700 grams. And the other guy, I'm sure he didn't buy anything, because just like me, I thought, he said, this is saffron. And I was like, is this really saffron? Or this other guy who was selling a leather jacket, and I said, it feels like plastic. And that was the meeting in Marrakesh, United Nations climate meeting in Marrakesh in a nutshell. Every country had in Paris promised what they were going to do. But we needed to be sure that what was called saffron was really saffron. What was called a kilo of emissions reductions was really a kilo of emissions reductions. That we could compare your promises with yours and your pledges, so that every citizen movement, every environmental organization, and every journalist could start keeping track of our promise and could make sure that we were to deliver on our voluntarily promises. Nobody else forced us to do it. We promised it voluntarily, but now we need to keep track of our respective governments. So that's the lesson number 11, to make sure that we help each other with the pledges that we have, and so that we can compare the promises. We move on, another time zone across the Atlantic. We needed to talk about Trump. There's no way of avoiding it. And Trump, to my mind, is the best thing that happened to the climate change issue. I know you look surprised, but when we had Trump, you know, every agreement needs a serious shake to see if it withstands the test of time. And Trump was that test. When at the Paris meeting, on the third day, Trump was elected. And even though the Paris Agreement was the fastest signed and ratified convention in the history of the United Nations, the media story after Trump was elected was immediately that the Paris Agreement is down the drain, it's not going to happen. But then it took only one day. And then China stepped forward and said, we're not going to let some president-elect change our long-term strategy. It was, and it will be the Paris Agreement. Country after country said, well, we're going to do, not like Trump, but like the Chinese. We stick to the agreement. Then day number 2, it was first a letter from 300 American CEOs, company leaders, to the United Nations meeting. CC President-elect Donald Trump, please stick to the Paris Agreement. We finally know long-term what's going to happen. And then on day 3, it was the cities, like this guy, the governor of California, cities around the world, businesses, states, that said, well, he's not the real America, we are the real America. And when you now come to climate summits, like the one a few weeks ago in Bonn, there's an official delegation with the Trump people, tiny, and then there's huge we the people delegation where the cities and the companies and the states show that they want to do more. And I don't know what football team you support, but back home in Stockholm, I support Hammarby. And Hammarby would be nothing if we were not against AIK. We need an AIK in order to exist. And the whole climate community, all of us fighting for this issue, need somebody to be against. And we got Trump. That's the best common enemy that we could ever possibly get. And I want you to try this. I want you to do a test I did. Next time you take the subway, you take the tram, you do like I did when I took the subway in Stockholm. You know, everybody's always just looking at their phones and not talking to anyone. But I put the phone in my pocket, and then I said to the nearest person, I said, Trump. And I just shook my head. And immediately had a new friend. So Trump really works. He works wonders. Thank you. And I'm sure he would be pissed off if he realized the positive effect he has. 13th, we're reaching the end here. 13th out of 15 time zones, we're now in Mexico. I was at the Future Urban Mobility Award ceremony in Berlin. One of the participants was Mexico City. The others had incredible hyperloop systems of things that would fly or drones that would carry people, all far off in the future. And the Mexicans were slumping down in the chairs because what they had was super boring. What they had was this. They have 20 million people stuck in traffic in Mexico City every day. Then they realized that means that we have 20 million people with smartphones in their pockets. And just by tracking these smartphones, not big data, just 20 million existing small data, means that we know that, there is a bus that can go fairly fast. There is a need for extra buses, and we should redirect this bus so it goes that way. And just by using that, they could make sure that people got to their job in time, so that people could pick up their kids from kindergarten after job on time, and so that more people would trust public transport because they would get there faster, just by using existing data. And then I was so happy to see that actually the winner of the Future Urban Mobility Award was the Mexicans, because this is something that can really happen today. And we have a prize in Sweden, which I chair, which is called the Unexpected Climate Hero of the Year. The first year that prize was given to Spotify. Who here uses Spotify? Who here uses Spotify to combat climate change? Not even me. Not even me. But the first year we gave this prize to Spotify, and the commercial director of Spotify came to receive the award. Her hair was all over the place. She looked like she'd just come from an after party with Guns N' Roses or something. And she certainly didn't look like she thought a lot about climate change. So we had to explain to her that before Spotify, most people would have something like 400 to 600 CDs at home. They would have one CD player at home, another one in the pocket. You know you need to walk like this to make sure that it still works. A third one in your car, a fourth one in your cottage. And depending on how many CDs you have and what kind of electricity you use, now that you have all the world's music with you all the time, that's about a 70% CO2 emissions reductions. So that's another thing you can do. When you're tired of saying Trump to those people at the tram, start saying, well, you're a climate saver, when you see somebody listening to Spotify on their phones. And that's just beginning. Because those smartphones, you know, before we had the smartphones, well, we needed a separate GPS, a separate camera, a separate video camera, a separate radio, and we can move, there's like 30 or 40 devices in here. So even though we didn't really intend to save the climate, we just accidentally started doing it just by having all the world's music with us, or just by being more efficient in transport. Second to last of my 15 time zones, Rapa Nui, the Easter Island. I'd be surprised if anyone here has been there. I used to live in Chile, like I think you mentioned, and then even there, it's 5 hours flying to get there. You just pass water, there's nothing, and then nothing. And if you go there like to Heyerdahl, the Norwegian, on a boat that you construct yourself, it's going to take several months. And these people, Rapa Nui means the navel of the world, because they thought, well, we are the center of the universe. And that's why they put up all these statues facing the water. And the way to get the statues to the waterfront was by cutting down the trees and using them as rolling logs, so you could roll the statues. And after a while, there wasn't any more trees. And when there wasn't any more trees, the topsoil would go into the ocean. And when there's no more topsoil, there's no more food after just a few years. And when there's no more food, there's no more civilization after a few months. And then we asked the astronauts, you know, there's only about 20 people who have been up in space. We asked them, what did we learn from going up into space? And they said, well, we learned to finally see planet Earth. To finally realize that planet Earth is much like the Easter Island or Rapa Nui in a huge ocean. Sure, it might be possible to live on Mars, or to live on the moon, or to even find life in some distant galaxy. All of that is possible, but it's virtually certain that for this generation, for us living now, this is the only home that we have. And I have this as my second to last argument, a way of phrasing climate issues, because I know that many people tend to not react positively to this idea about that we need to protect this civilization, because otherwise there's just doom and gloom. Because when you speak to behavioral psychologists, they say that many people move directly from denial to despair. First, you're in denial. Climate change is not very sure. In fact, it's very cold outside. Or it's been a volcano. It's something with a solar activity. Or we're soon going to enter into an ice age. And then they realize that's not true. We are. It is something that we need to combat. But then they move directly to despair. This is so sure, so we cannot do anything about it. 1 billion Chinese already have fridges. 1.5 billion Chinese already have cars. 2 billion Chinese people already fly on their vacation to Europe. So why would you want to spend your time on working on this? It's pointless. So that's why we need to stop people when they start moving from denial. We need to stop them from going directly to despair. And I think simple examples like the Spotify examples is a way to stop people from going directly to despair. And 15th and last, and I bring this last as I feel that we're now friends and family, so I can be honest with my failures to you. 15th is the Arctic. You know, it could be any time zone because you have all the time zones in the Arctic. 15th is the very symbol of the combat of climate change, the polar bear. And it is a very poor, very bad symbol. Anyone here works or has worked or have experience from marketing? A few. Anyone here has not seen an advertisement? No, we have all. And in those advertisements, we almost always see someone who looks like we do, seems to be in the same situation and context like we do, except they're a little bit more successful, look a little bit better, maybe a little bit smarter, seem to have a little bit more friends than we have, a little bit more successful. We want to be like them. Now, anybody here who wants to be a polar bear? That's why you will never find a polar bear in a commercial for chewing gum or for cars or anything. You will always find somebody who looks like us, but just a little bit better, a little bit more successful. And if you were to meet a polar bear, I doubt that you would even try to have a conversation with the bear. You should not. You should run in the opposite direction. So I'm thinking, with this very poor symbol, that even the beginners in communication, the beginners in working with commercials would tell us that's the worst symbol you can possibly choose. But with such a poor symbol, and with all the mistakes that we made in commuting climate change, we've come this far anyway. We came to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement withstood the Trump shake. We realized now that renewable energy is often cheaper than non-renewables, that there's more jobs in it, less dependency on Russia. We realized that a lot of the solutions are actually something that we just find more attractive or more practical. Then the future looks bright and rosy because we've come so far being so poor at communicating this. And now we take the next step. We find those time zones that we find the most relevant. We make the best mix, and we move forward together. Thank you so much.
You gave me so much inspiration that I want to save my questions to the roundtable discussion. So I'll give the floor pretty soon to the audience. Just wanted to share with you one moment of amusement from the audience that you might not have understood. You have to be aware of the Hungarian context to know. It's related to football stadiums, to soccer stadiums. I just wanted to proudly share with you the information that we have a lot of them. They are big and nice and new, and we might use them for a lot of things in the future.
Thank you.
I'm not sure you still understand, but I'll tell you in the break. By the way, with the break, you said you wanted to go over disagreements with some people that might support President Putin. I anchor a Hungarian political talk show, and I have a long list of people that you should talk to.
All right, great.
Maybe. So
I'm here
I'd be happy. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's your time to ask questions. Go ahead.
So I don't have one question, but I want to share some experience as a Chinese here. So it's like my dad closed his business several years ago. He worked on the coal mining, and because the government did close a lot of the coal mining plants in China, especially the small one. And also it's like since I was a child, in our family, many families in our city, we use the solar power for the hot water in the house. And also it's like, even now, a lot of people around me in China, they use a car with the natural gas. It's like half of the people around me, they use a natural gas car. And also it's like, there is an electronic bus factory near Budapest, and they are selling, it's a Chinese one, they are selling the electronic bus to the Western Europe. And I want to say it's like, even though the Chinese products is cheap, and a lot of people buying it, and also we produce a lot of pollution with actual energy consuming. But I want to say it's like, because people around the world, they are buying it. If people stop buying the €1 products with free delivery from the Alibaba, and it will be good. I mean, we will dramatically reduce the carbon steps we make. And yeah, China definitely is the producer of the global warmth, but many of us here, we are the consumer of the global warmth. So that's what I want to share. Thank you.
She's so right.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think the stupidest mistake Trump did was to step back just when this was accelerating. And I think China was very wise to quickly step in. One more example of how China has been reacting wisely. Do you remember this car, the Hummer? Huge SUV. It was made by General Motors. And then General Motors couldn't find more buyers for this kind of car. It's more like yesterday's than tomorrow's buyer. And then there was a Chinese billionaire who wanted to buy the plant so that he could produce this car in China. But then the Chinese government said, no, we are not going to allow this business because this is not how we want to be perceived in the future. So I see a very swift and very positive movement in terms of environmental, stepping up to the challenge from your country.
How about that part that she was talking about, our consumer power on their backs?
It's interesting because, you know, in Sweden, and I think most of the countries that have been here on stage, we pride ourselves of reducing our emissions a lot. Part of it is true, but part of it is also that if I had been here in the 70s or 80s, all of this wouldn't have been Swedish. I guess this is probably now maybe Thailand, this is probably China, the shoes might also be China. And then we say, hey, your Chinese emissions are up. Are they really yours, or are they ours? Is it all the stuff that we buy on Alibaba, and is it all the stuff that we did ourselves before? Now it's done in Thailand and China. I think we need to step up and say, well, it's maybe on your account, but it's my emissions.
Other questions? There, the lady.
Thank you. Mattias, very inspiring speech. Thank you for that. My question would be about Forest, your organization. Could you please tell a few words about it, how it works, what is your team, topics, your agenda for this year, for instance?
Thank you. I was thinking that I hate it when people speak too much about themselves. But okay, just a little bit. So Forest is Forum for Reforms, Entrepreneurship and Sustainability. We're a think tank based in Sweden with offices around Sweden, so we're not just Stockholm and the capital. And we like to make sure that there's an entrepreneurial business touch to reaching the climate targets. We want to see Sweden as a front mover. So we work with climate change. We also work with migration and integration. That's why I could not help myself but to put one picture of it in there. Because we see that in order to be proud of what we see in our mirror, we need to be more welcoming to our brothers and sisters in need. That's a short-term target. And the long-term target is to give something to our children and grandchildren. We need to combat climate change. So those are the two big topics that we work with. We're an independent and not-for-profit.
Thank you.
I wonder what you think about the solar panel tariffs in the European Union, because it looks like a misguided effort to stop Chinese, solar panel production coming to European Union.
What I think about the Chinese solar panels coming?
No. So what do you think about the tariffs, the European tariffs that are trying to slow down the Chinese, solar panel products?
I think it's disappointing. I think the Trump solar panel tariffs are worse, but I think you got to be very careful when you put up tariffs and other barriers to trade, and when you're trying to stop something that's obviously helping us to combat the battle of our life, which is the battle against climate change. I think it's very unwise.
Some other questions? Maybe I can afford one last one.
All right, yeah.
It's related to your life with facts, feelings, and motivations, both individual and communal. You are a distinguished researcher. Everybody admires your work. But at some point in your life, maybe you did it other times, not only once, you went by train from place to place, from village to village, to talk to local stakeholders and local people about what should be done. What's your assessment? What's most important to make people change their views? Facts or personal encounters?
I think, as Force is a research-based organization, so it's partially disappointing to say that facts don't matter all that much. and
that's my feeling as a journalist too, so I was expecting this answer.
And certainly some of the facts that we've been using a lot, like the 2-degree target. Who understands what that means? What is it compared with? And when I ask people in the cold place like Sweden, 2 degrees warmer, they say, yes, please, can we have free? If we stop those electric cars, we keep the engines running, we'd love to have it a bit warmer. And we talk about 400 ppm threshold, stuff like that. No, that doesn't matter. It's the personal story, the personal gains. And I think what we heard earlier today about why Copenhageners bike, that was really an eye-opener to me. If I remember the survey correctly, the bikers were asked, and they could give multiple answers, so the total can be much more than 100%. They were asked, so why do you bike in Copenhagen? And almost a split first place with more than 50% on each was, I save time. It's good for my health, and I save money. And then dead last, with only 7%, even though you could choose more than one answer, was because of climate reasons. So we need to find what's in it for me and what's in it for you. And that's, by the way, that's fairly easy now. The Spotify example is just one of many, how it's so much better for the local economy and for even us as a household and a person.
And also with your Spotify example, when you measure the cons and pros of changing from one way to the other, just wanted to bring the example of the Spotify thing. We save the world by not having CDs anymore. But at the same time, I mean, no. I mean, we are doing better by not having those things. Let's not be dramatic. But at the same time, iPhones, one part of them needs some exploitation in Africa that needs to be stopped at some point. And we need that for Spotify. So what's the list? How do we measure what can be done today for tomorrow, but it's still exploitation?
I'm always worried that we try and solve one problem at a time, and if we're unlucky, you know, it's like beating those frogs at the amusement park. Another one just pops up, and if we're unlucky, it pops up worse because we managed to hit one. And your example is exactly that. If we go into electromobility, which is a good thing for the climate, is a good thing for the local environment and for health, and it might be great for the local economy, and then we have those appalling working condition in the cobalt mines in Congo, for instance. And we've accepted that. We've accepted that for more than 20 years because we know that, many of us, in the cell phones. But now, largely thanks to electromobility and electric cars, companies like BMW are saying, well, we don't want that tarnished, we don't want blood on our badge. So there's finally, thanks to electromobility, there's finally now being put pressure to have reasonable working conditions in those mines. And the other thing that's happening is that a battery in this phone is very small. It doesn't make much sense to try and recycle it, hardly. But a car battery in an electric car is big. So sooner or later, we're going to be in the circular economy where most of those metals are not going to come from the ground, but from existing batteries, second-hand usage. They can be used over and over and over again with no deterioration to the metal.
I hope you are. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.